Lion Boy, Chapter 17. The lights came up, the applause died down. The audience were drifting up the grand staircase, saying, "Wasn't that fantastic? Wasn't that just wonderful? That bit when the... and how about when the... and that girl? I've never seen anything like it." The last sparks of fireworks were drifting back down to the sink in the murky waters of the canal basin. Charlie, out on deck, invisible in the shadows, heard them plop and fizz. He saw Mabel and Macomo, heads together, emerging from the main entrance from the crowd. Raffy was with them. He sauntered a step or two behind, with the dog, Troy, on a lead. Every now and again, he leaned forward to say something, and when he did, Macomo turned back to him with a smile. Charlie, keeping himself invisible in the crowd behind them, got the impression that Macomo had arranged to meet Raffy, but didn't want him hanging around. He was being polite, though. It wasn't often that Macomo took the trouble to be polite. The trio headed out onto the gangplank. Go on, breathed Charlie. They were leaving. Charlie nipped through the crowd and out into the gardens, where he was able to overtake them. Lurking in the shadow of the shrubbery, he could see their faces in the crowd. Mabel looked annoyed, and she wanted to be alone with Macomo. Raffy had moved up between her and the lion trainer and was saying something. As they passed by Charlie's hiding place, Charlie strained to hear, but he couldn't make anything out. Then the men turned and, excusing themselves from Mabel, moved away from the path, the light and the crowd. Charlie melted into the darkness. They were coming towards him. His heart was patting and he slipped behind a tree. Raffy and Macomo, in the shadows, hidden from the crowded path by a bush, were standing and pretending to have a wee. Charlie could see and hear them clearly. He could only hope that they could not see or they could not hear him. He breathed lightly and silently. His asthma had passed and he felt fit, strong and ready. "So, Macomo," Raffy was saying, "if your Lion Boy can do what you say, then obviously I have clients who would be interested in that. Any genuine, unusual talent, genetic variation, skills, that kind of thing can always sell. You know that, but I've got to know that it's genuine. I can't turn up with some trick. This is science, not the circus. Do you know what I mean? So you enjoy your dinner with your young lady." Here, Raffy seemed to suppress a laugh. "And tomorrow I'll come and I'll have a look at him. And then we'll see what we can do, all right?" Charlie, deep in the shadows, gave a dark smile. So that was it. Macomo had told Raffy about the cat speaking. Raffy sells skills and talents, so Raffy had stolen his parents in order to sell them on. And now Raffy wants to buy him, to sell him on too. But who to? The same people who have his parents, maybe. That would be one way of getting to where they were. Daft. But Raffy obviously didn't know that the cat-speaking Lion Boy is Charlie Ashanti. How long before Macomo lets slip Charlie's name? And Raffy realises that boy with a talent is also the boy he was after anyway. The moment Macomo tells Raffy my name, thought Charlie, I am in deep doo-doo. Raffy was still talking. "So my compliments to Mrs. Stark," he said smoothly, "and I'll see you tomorrow." They started to move away towards the bright lights. "By the way," said Raffy, "where is he now?" "What, the Lion Boy?" said Macomo in his soft voice. "He'll be back on the boat somewhere. I don't know, maybe with the lions." What's his name?" said Raffy. Charlie. Charlie. "Charlie what?" said Raffy, with a sudden keen look. Charlie turned. He heard Mabel's voice behind him, calling, "Come on, Macomo, what's keeping you?" He ran, quicker than Raffy, but only Charlie knew that the race was on. Straight to the ship, straight to the lion cabin. 6 sets of yellow eyes greeted him in the darkness of the cabin, and a new kind of energy awoke in him. He took the big, heavy, old key from its hook, and he unlocked the cages. "How goes it, Lion Boy?" came the voice of the oldest lion. "Fine," said Charlie shortly. Raffy's here. We're off. Now! The oldest lion heard the urgency in his voice. Ride the young lion, he said. Quicker! Charlie didn't hesitate. It was true a lion could not hide so well in the shadows with a boy on his back, but it was even truer that a boy is slower than a lion. He grabbed his jacket, shouldered his bag, gave the young lion a grin, and slipped out of the door to the cabin. All was quiet outside, just as he had expected. But Raffy was out there and coming after them. Charlie made himself look around carefully before letting the lions slide out, and then he closed the door again behind them and he locked it. He remembered his mum's lab door, swinging open when it should have been shut, right at the beginning of the adventure. His first warning of danger. His heart was pounding like a woodpecker, quick, light and relentless. Charlie could hardly see the lions as they slunk against the walls of the cabin in the dark areas where neither moonlight nor lamplight fell. Over by the gangplank, the sounds of voices and activity bustled and hummed. Laughter came across the water and the lights twinkled. Way above, along the boulevard, above the basin, street lights and people, traffic were going about their business. Behind them lay the ship and the canal and the way they had come so far. Ahead of them lay the run down to where the canal met the river, and then the river itself, where they had to cross to get to the station. The rest of the night was dark and quiet, cool, damp and rivery. The moon was still low. The lions hooded their eyes and disappeared, no more than dark shadows themselves as they glided along the stern, breathing fresh air for the first time in months. It took no more than seconds for them to slide over the balustrade and onto the rope. A few seconds more to slither across the rope to the shore. They didn't give a second glance to the dark space between the ship and the quayside, to the gleaming cold water at the bottom of the deep abyss, or the slimy green weed which was slippery on the wall of the quay. Charlie, for a horrible moment, wondered how he was meant to get across. Could he clamber across that horrible gap, clutching the nasty, rough, slippery, salty rope? The young lion was beside him. On, he hissed, his breath warm in the darkness, and Charlie was glad to climb onto his long back and lie clasped to him. He smelt the warm, sweet, furry smell, and feeling the muscles move beneath him as the lion, like a river made flesh, slid along the railings and across the rope. Go, go, hissed Charlie. His hands caught up in the young lion's shaggy mane, his legs clutching tight on the golden back. Raffy could be under any tree, behind any bush. With any luck, he was on the ship, trying and failing to get into the lion cabin. But who now could count on luck? The young lion began to run, and Charlie realised he was panting. There was the shrubbery and the shadows. He had counted on being safe in the shadows, but now the shadows themselves held danger. There was a shout behind them, angry, violent. His name, Charlie! Charlie, you little scumbag! It was Raffy, definitely. Ignore it, Charlie cried. Go on! The lions were quicker than Raffy. Best to race ahead. Faster! He hissed in the young lion's ear, and the young lion ran. So did the oldest lion, and so did Elsina. The lionesses did not. They growled. Behind him, as they hurtled through the damp night air, Charlie heard another shout, a cry, a scream, a dreadful scream and a splash which chilled his soul. He tried to look over his shoulder. What was that? He yelled. The young lions didn't slacken. Stop! Charlie shrieked. Don't! He didn't even know quite whom he was yelling to or what he was telling them to stop. All he did know, deep inside him, was the dreadfulness of that scream. Until he heard it, it had not occurred to him that the lions might not agree with him, might not obey him, not really. Now, that single sound reminded him, these are wild animals. They hunt for food. They've been locked up for years. That's an enemy chasing after them. Shut up, panted the young lion. Just shut up and never mind. Never mind. Charlie closed his eyes and hung on for dear life. He had never seen the lions out in the open, with room enough to pick up some pace, and they were quick. They were in the park, alongside the Porte de Plaisance, in no time, hugging the walls and sprinting through the gaps. Rose bushes dangled their flowers above them, and the high wall was to the left, the moored boats down to the right. In moments they reached the end of the park. We must go back, Charlie thought. We must go back. That was a human being. Yes, but it was Raffy. And Raffy, wounded and in the water, was better than Raffy, strong, angry, and coming after them. Of course they couldn't go back. Under the high walls at the far end of the basin, the lions ran swift and silent over the cobbles, avoiding iron rings set in for the boats to moor to, and bollards lurking in the dim light. The noise of the traffic drifted down to them from the boulevard as they lurched along in the damp basin. The old stone wall was set with iron gates and mysterious doorways racing past. Charlie had no time to wonder where they led. He just hung on tight. A flurry of ducks, disturbed and quacking, scurried into the water with an unnaturally loud splashing. The final lock before the canal met the River Seine under a road bridge. The sign said no entry. The lions swiftly sneaked under the bar and brought themselves to a halt in the silent darkness on the narrow footpath beside the canal under the bridge. "What happened?" gasped Charlie. "What have they done?" The oldest lion gave him a curious look. "That was your enemy," he said. "The one who stole your parents. The one who threatens you." "Yes," said Charlie, puzzled. "It didn't seem that simple, though." Yeah, but what if Raffy was dead?" He didn't really want to say this out loud. The young lion cocked his head. Elsina was breathing fast and smooth, looking back to where her mother must be. And where were the lionesses? They all stared back the way they had come. No sound, and nothing to be seen. The loch was right beside them, horribly deep, horribly dark, shiny and close. The drop into the river, beyond the pale green metal lock gates, was even deeper and darker. Trickles of water seeped through the metal plates, making a small echoey noise. On one side of the thin-looking gates was high dark water, on the other a deep drop into blackness. Charlie, rolling from the young lion's back, kept himself close to the wall. He was grateful to find a cold, narrow metal handrail to hold on to. All they needed now was for someone to fall into that black abyss. He was glad that they only had to go alongside the canal. Crossing it could have been even worse. They breathed and they rested for a moment. Above them, beyond the road bridge, there was a second bridge over the canal, and then almost immediately there was another. They had to pass under all three before they got to the river, wide, swift and dark. "Charlie," said the oldest lion. At that moment a thundering dragon roared across the next bridge. Instinctively they all flattened against the damp wall, staring wildly at the monster as it passed. A few of the monster's eyes stared back. It was a metro train, full of people which were going home late. Some of them, staring out of the window into the night, saw the reflective gleam of 6 yellow eyes, but they would never guess what it was that they'd seen. "Before another one comes," the oldest lion hissed. "But the lionesses!" cried Charlie, his voice tangled. "Trust them," said the oldest lion. "They're hunters, and you must not be caught." Charlie was not comforted to hear that they were hunters. "Have they eaten him?" he whispered. Though Raffy was his enemy and meant him nothing but harm, he couldn't bear that thought. "We're lions, Charlie," the oldest lion said softly. "We hunt and we eat." Charlie stared at him. Everywhere he looked in himself, he saw fear. "But we are not stupid," the oldest lion continued. "We eat at leisure, not when we're escaping with our lives. We do not eat humans on human territory. We are not stupid." Charlie gulped. He was fooling himself if he thought that he was in charge of anything here. "Onwards," said the oldest lion. Just by the stern of the Circe, a lumbering, spitting shape was emerging from the dark, cold water, shattering the reflections of street lights and circus lights into 1,000 wet shards across the surface. His white hands clutched the stone blocks which were lining the quay, and he pulled himself heavily out of the water. His leather coat was sodden, and his face was furious. His movements were stilted, one of his arms was weak, and in his hand he clutched a small clump of something wet and dark. It was a tiny handful of dark golden fur, sodden with the canal water. As he came to standing, he wiped his pale face with his good arm, and then he touched his bad arm. Even in the dim light, he could see on his fingers that the water dripping off him was mixed with blood. "Troy!" he bellowed. A big dog lolloped up to him, mewling and limping, with a wounded back leg. He held out the clump of soggy fur to the animal's twitching nose. "Fetch!" he said, and his voice was grim. Charlie climbed back slowly onto the young lion's back. Though the young lion was sure-footed, the towpath was narrowing, and the water seemed just too close now. As the lion lolloped along, the black water raced past just beneath his right foot. Beneath the road bridge and the metro bridge, a metal spiral staircase led up the street level to the left. A group of people went past and the road up there, laughing and playing around. Charlie and the lions ducked swiftly under the black, industrial-looking girders of the metro bridge. Had they seen? A pigeon, confused by the presence there so late at night, suddenly flew out, flapping and flustering. Some small, black, fluttery shapes moved in the darkness. Bats. Another small gap of sky, and then was the third and the final bridge over the canal, much bigger, more modern-looking, more like a flyover, a great concrete construction, 20th century probably, and the noise from it was thunderous as vehicles roared by overhead. The towpath continued underneath, and they followed it out to the river. Charlie realised that he had made a big mistake. The young lion and Elsina stopped abruptly. The oldest lion, just behind, caught up with them. The towpath, when they finally turned the corner and emerged from the flyover, led onto a tiny narrow ledge at the base of the great high concrete wall. It separated the flyover from the river, and the ledge led not to the bridge, but on as far as the eye could see, stuck between the deep mobile water of the Seine on the right and the 12-metre sheer wall sloping to the left. It was about half a metre. The bridge they needed, the bridge which crossed the river, was only a couple of 100 metres away, but it was also a couple of 100 metres above them, and there was no way up there. Charlie stared at it. The lion stared at it. Charlie remembered again how his dad said it was good not to swear, because that way you kept the swear words for when you really needed one. Charlie swore. The mothers knew exactly what they were doing. The silvery lioness headed back the way they had come, on the Circe and off down the mooring rope and onto the bow, and then along the water's edge to the tunnel leading under Bastille Metro back into the Canal Saint-Martin. When she reached the third skylight, only dimly lit by the street lights from above, she paused, she breathed, and she waited. The bronze lioness went across the park until she came to a high wall. She sloped alongside it, passing the mysterious iron gates and doorways until she came to one which was open. She slunk in, and from within she climbed carefully onto the top of the door, where she paused, breathed and waited. The yellow lioness, with blood on her claws, raced down to the lock, but she was too late to reach Charlie and the others. She had been there. She could smell them. If she could, then the dog would be able to she would be able to too. The golden lioness flicked her whiskers, squatted down, and then she peed. She peed a lot. She stared through the gloom trying to make out the other side of the canal, but she could not see clearly. And then, elegantly, carefully, she picked her way across the slender top of the lock gate. Cold, deep water on one side, 6-metre drop into cold, deep water on the other. At the other side she checked. Yes, a huge, rusty, spiked metal barrier bolted into the wall blocked the towpath on that side. Clearly, people were not meant to use this side. She flicked her whiskers. She had seen locks before, and her plan, it would work. She shivered, she paused, she breathed, and she waited. They couldn't go back. They couldn't stay here. They couldn't do anything. There was just no time to think. So were they going to swim? Charlie looked out at the Seine, wide, rushing, and undoubtedly cold. He looked at the wall, and then he looked at the ledge. He thought of all that Siggy had told him about balance and agility and trusting your body. I've done handstands in the rigging of the Circe, he thought. I can do this. Come on, he said, and he made to lead the lions out. One moment, said the young lion. Take my tail. So the young lion led, and Charlie held on to his strong, wiry tail. Elsina and the oldest lion followed on behind, treading carefully on their sensitive cat feet and using their tails for balance. Way above and beyond them was the whole of the great city of Paris. It was carrying on its lights, its people, its busy roads, and its chattering restaurants, its trees and its late-night shopping, its cars, its bars, its trains and parties, its hospitals, stations, harbours and circuses. And all along, in the heart of the city, this little queue of lions and boy walked slowly, carefully, invisibly, along a narrow ledge between the water and the wall, and nobody knew they were there. Way beyond Paris, at this very moment, though Charlie could not know it, his parents were being taken from a huge car park, through a beautiful moonlit subtropical garden full of palm trees and huge rounded rocks with a stream trickling over them. It led into a large, complex, low-lying building. Not that Magdalene and Aniba could see it, because they were still blindfolded. "Hi there," smiled a pretty receptionist in the entrance hall. She had a plant on her desk, and her eyes were blue and round, and her clothes extremely clean. She didn't seem to notice that the 2 guests were bound and gagged, or that the 3 men from the personnel department were propelling them at gunpoint. She didn't even seem to know that it was the middle of the night. "Hi there, we have an appointment with the chief executive," smiled one of the personnel guys. "New staff arriving." "Hey, welcome to the gated village community, where we embrace your aspirations," the receptionist said cheerfully. "And you are?" Aniba and Magdalene said nothing. They couldn't. They were still gagged. "It's Professor Start and Dr. Ashanti," said the other personnel guy. Magdalene was wondering why they were talking in exclamation marks, why the air smelt so sweet and cold, and why such cheerful people didn't care about blindfolds, gags and guns. And what were they all doing at work at this time? Aniba was trying to identify the smell in the cool air. His nose twitched, and his brain ran through its enormous knowledge of chemicals, plants and aromas. "Great! The asthma guys," the reception cried and picked up the phone. "He'll see you now. He sounds so pleased to know that you're here." The lights twinkled above and far away. The lion's tail was firm, rough and warm in Charlie's hand. The cold night river air rose up to his right. The hard, cold, steep concrete wall stood immovably to his left. The dark water was just there beside him. Step by step, carefully and slowly, he looked at the young lion's back. He didn't look at anything else. Not at the necklaces of lights on the far, far riverbank. Not the great high bridge growing in height as they drew nearer to it. Step by step. He wanted desperately to look behind him and see if the mothers had caught up with them, but he couldn't. If he looked anywhere other than the lion's back, he would fall, and it was that simple. Step by step, He had to place his feet a little closer together on each pace than he would naturally, because the ledge was so narrow. It made him feel slightly as if he was going to lose his balance, step by step, watching the lion's back, breathing, tall and strong. The bridge loomed up in front of them, white and calm. The flyover to his left had swooped down now behind the Great Wall, and its wide road plummeting under the bridge. The ledge continued alongside, and so Charlie and the lions continued alongside too, under the bridge that they so longed to cross. As they came out the other side, the ledge widened a little, and Charlie took the courage to look back up at the bridge. There was nothing they could climb up to get onto it, so how were they going to get up there? There was another bridge, way ahead upriver. Even if they could get to that one, it was too far away. They had a train to catch, and an angry guy with a big dog was chasing them. Now he could see the great iron and glass curve of the roof of the station, just there across the river, so near, only 100 metres. For a second, he looked down the water that separated him and the station, and he shivered. And then the young lion stopped. Charlie let go of his tail in surprise. The lion flicked it, once this way and once that. "Charlie," he hissed over his shoulder. "Yes," whispered Charlie. "There's an entrance here, a small tunnel. We could go in there. What do you think?" Troy was at first confused by the scent of the 3 lionesses going in 3 different directions. Raffi stood dripping on the quayside by the Circe, glaring at him. "Find the scent, Troy," he said in a dangerously polite tone. Some last stragglers from the audience noticed him and stood for a moment looking in on curiosity at this sodden, angry youth. He jerked his head back and gave them such a filthy look that they fled, chattering. Troy ran to and fro, whining and snuffling at the ground. Here, there, then he picked up the scent of the yellow lioness, whose fur he had been given to smell, and he raced swiftly down the basin after her. When he came to the lock, he balked at following the scent across the narrow gate tops, but with Raffi yelling at him from behind, he had little choice. Raffi followed him, nimbly, considering he couldn't move his arm. The lioness was perched motionless on top of the remote lock control. In the dark, she just looked like a lump. Troy knew he was close, but he had no idea how close. The beam that passing boats had to break to operate the lock shone out invisibly just beneath her. As Raffi and Troy reached the safety, as they thought it, of the other side, she let her tail droop. She flicked it across the beam. Yes. A creak and a shudder warned that the lock gates were beginning to open. A growl and a leap and a thwack in the face with a golden tail was enough to confuse Raffi and Troy. Another leap onto the gates as they began to swing open, and from one gate to the other, yes, just before they swung too far open for the gap to be leapt, there they were. Raffi and Troy on the far side of the canal, with no way back till the slow-moving lock closed again in, 20 minutes. The young lioness gleaming her teeth at them from this side. She gave a short, sharp roar. The silvery lioness heard her, and using the same trick, set off the lock at the other end of the basin. It wouldn't start to work until the first lock was closed again, but for now, Raffi and Troy were cut off. And however they tried to cross back, they would take much longer. Then the silvery lioness and the bronze lioness left their hiding places and swiftly and quietly hurtled down to join her. "We should go in," said the young lion. "It might lead somewhere, and anywhere is better than here." "Okay," said Charlie, glad that someone else had made the decision. He called back to the others what they were going to do, and then took the lion's tail again as they plunged into the darkness of this tiny riverside tunnel. It led directly into the bank. Inside it was dark, and the water in there was smelly and scummy. Plastic bottles bobbed, and Charlie could tell from the smell that there was litter and dirty caked up bubbles. That meant that the water stopped somewhere up ahead of them. Moving water would not smell this bad, if only the path would continue. It did. 20 metres inside the tunnel, The ledge suddenly widened out into a stone quay, like the ones by the Canal St. Martin, and the water came to an end. Charlie could just make out what looked like a big round pipe sticking out of the wall ahead of them, dripping weed and smelling disgusting. Drains, Charlie thought. Sewage maybe. Old drains. An open doorway led into the wall beside the quay. Again the stonework was old and finely made, but by the look of it, nobody ever came here. "Stay here a moment," he whispered to the lions. "I'll go and see where it leads." He hoped that the lionesses would catch up while they stopped. Catch them up and say that the splash was just someone falling in, that the scream was just a scream of somebody getting wet. Wrinkling their noses and flaring their whiskers at the smell, the lions prepared to wait. Concentrate, thought Charlie. Be grateful. If he's in the canal, or if they've wounded him, he won't be following, or at least not too quickly. "I'll be as quick as I can," he said. "Thanks," said Alcina, whose little nose was as wrinkled up as a prune. She laid down on the stone pavement and buried it into her paws. Through the door was a staircase cut into stone. Up the staircase was another doorway, and through that doorway was a chamber. Charlie silently peered through to see what was there. It was mostly dark, but there was a dim light coming from somewhere, just enough to show him that the chamber was smallish, grubby, and absolutely filled with rubbish. But it was not just a dump, it was organised. 3 supermarket trolleys were stood in a row, full of bits of old-fashioned wires, plugs, and the inside of electrical equipment. One corner was piled high with big black plastic bags, some of which spilt pieces of cloth. Also, there was a small, low, fold-up table. It had a mug on it with some cushion arranged as though there was 2 or 3 people that might sit on them to talk to each other. And there was what could have been a bed. And on that bed was what could have been a person. And what could have been a person rolled over and snored deeply, flung out an arm, which knocked over a tall, ornate glass pipe, so the top fell off and some water spilt. Some last embers of tobacco fell out onto the floor, sending the sweet aromatic smell of apple tobacco out into the room, reminding Charlie of the Arab cafes in London and the delicious pastries made of nuts and honey. Concentrate! Across the room was a metal gate, and behind it the night sky with a huge road beneath it. Whoever brings his stuff in here must bring it in from somewhere. They must have access to the outside. They must have access on foot, somewhere other than the motorway flyover road, on which no one could walk. Charlie turned back down the stairs. Maybe the mothers will be there. They should have caught us up by now. They weren't, and they hadn't. He said to the lions, "Come on, there's someone up there, but he's asleep. Wait in the doorway, and I'll see if I can open the gate to the outside." His heart was beating fast as he led the lions back up the stairs. They coiled themselves into the doorway, just out of the light, and they waited for him silently. He stepped out into the deep, damp, dim, grubby room. Charlie felt very strongly his responsibility for them. It was difficult to cross that room in silence. There were things all over the floor. There were dark corners, curious shadows, and this scary, snoring figure. There was little light. It wasn't really Charlie's fault that he trod on an old roller skate and fell into a pile of scrap metal, hitting his head and yelled. Then the sleeping man woke up and he screeched. It certainly wasn't Charlie's fault that the lions glanced at each other and then leapt as one from the doorway into the man's bedside, where they surrounded him, staring down at him, the claws out and the eyes intent, their fang-filled jaws hanging open, growling and ready to pounce. "Stop it!" yelled Charlie. The poor man shrieked and shrieked. The oldest lion put his paw on his chest and roared. It worked. He stopped shrieking and he started whimpering instead. But this was at least was quieter. "Stop it," said Charlie, "please." The lions looked round. "You're scaring..." He was going to say, "You're scaring him." It came out as, "You're scaring me." Alcina looked at him sideways. The oldest lion flicked his whiskers. Sorry, said the young lion. Charlie thought quickly, and then he went over to this poor mangy bed. Shut up, but they're using a polite form of tassez-vous. Instead, the man might realise that he didn't mean to be rude. How silly. There were 3 lions sat on his chest. The man would be worrying about manners. He wouldn't be worrying about manners. We are a nightmare, he said. You mustn't tell anyone about us. Do you want to get rid of us? Tell us where the road is. Tell us how we get there. How do we get to the bridge? The man, he wasn't very old, and he had a pleasant face, as far as he could see beneath his terror, but he could not speak. He tried to, and he seemed to want to, but although his mouth moved and his tongue flapped, no noise emerged. Lions, murmured Charlie, perhaps you should get off him for a bit. The lions withdrew and lay like a circle of sphinxes close around the man. He looked up at Charlie, blinked and swallowed. Take your time, said Charlie, but not too long, we're in a hurry. The man looked back at the lions, then back at Charlie. When he spoke, finally, it was in Arabic. But they're Moroccan, he shouted. Indeed, said Charlie, a little surprised that the man should recognise them. So what? So am I, shouted the man. Having got his voice back, he didn't now seem to be able to control it. Fear does funny things to people sometimes. Salam alaikum, said Charlie. Now how do we get to the bridge? Left out of here, up the staircase, along, and it's on the left, the man said, staring and clutching his blanket to him. The gate is open. Thank you, said Charlie in Arabic. Alif sukur, 1,000 thanks. One is enough, said the man, wild-eyed as the lions trooped past him out onto the deserted, silent, midnight riverbank. Charlie had hoped that if anyone saw them, they'd think that there was a trick of the light, a cat or an urban fox. That cat looked huge, they might say. Did you see it? But the cat would be gone, and the night would be still again. But from the shadows at the top of the staircase, they could see that if it was still, far too busy for them to cross the bridge, on the pavement or on the road. On the outside of the bridge's wall, there was a ledge. It was much the same width as a ledge alongside the river, and it was about 100 metres up in the air. We can use that, said the oldest lion. Charlie looked at it. If he fell, he would tumble into the cold river or bash his head on the white stone bridge, or drown, or have a heart attack. The lions made themselves as flatfish and slithered above the wall. Charlie just held his tongue between his teeth and repeated the words, I have no choice, I have no choice. Just in time, he realised that of course he did have a choice. The lions, it was true, couldn't be seen wandering about the place without being picked up and taken back. But nobody would question a boy crossing a bridge. Why would they? See you on the other side, he hissed, ran and jumped across the bridge doing cartwheels and flip-flaps, just because he could, and because he was so scared that he would do anything to try and pretend that he was not. And that's the end of chapter 17.